Hey guys, welcome back to the Atlas Mitten Sew Along. In the last video, we cut out and prepared everything we needed to make the mittens, and in this video, I'm going to be showing you step by step how to sew everything together. So grab all of your materials for the project and let's get started. Alright, so it's time to get sewing, and the first thing we're going to start is sewing our mitten pieces, so the palm of the mitten. This may or may not be your first time sewing with leather, but it is quite different to sewing with regular fabric, so I just want to go over a couple things. Leather, unlike woven fabric, it's a skin, so if you punch a hole in it with your needle, that hole is going to stay. So just make sure that you're trying to not make a mistake here. But the other thing is that we just need to consider our stitch length for the stitch on the leather. So I'm going to bump my stitch length up a little bit longer than I normally would sew. My normal stitch length is about 2.5 on most fabrics, so I'm going to bump it up to 3, but I want you guys to just test with your leather, because every leather is going to have a different density, thickness, and every machine is different. So you just want to make sure you're testing this stitch length with your leather. When you're sewing this stitch, you just want to be careful that the stitches aren't too close together, that the leather tears when the seam is sewn. They should be spaced out so that the leather has some room to breathe in between the stitches, but that the seam is a good quality seam that's going to stay together. Now, the other thing is, I recommended earlier just using a regular size 14 or 16 needle. When you're getting to this point where you're ready to sew your leather, just test that the needle is working with your leather. If you're experiencing slipped stitches, then you're going to need a leather needle. I'm having luck with sewing a size 14 to 16 regular needle, so that's what I'm going to use. I'm also just using regular thread for this project, and I'm just using the same thread throughout. I'm not too concerned about whether the thread matches all of my colors. I'm just gonna match it to my leather. And the other thing is that I'm gonna be sewing with a walking foot. You don't have to do this, but if you do have a walking foot, it's a really helpful thing to use when you're sewing with thicker fabrics that might have a little bit of a difficult time getting fed evenly through the machine. That is basically the setup for my machine here. And the first thing I'm gonna do is sew along I'm going to call it the thumb seam on these two leather pieces. So this is piece B and C. So I'm just going to clip these edges together before I sew, and I'm going to be sewing this seam at 1/4 inch. All of my seams for this project are 1/4 inch long. Just let's talk about 1/4 inch on your sewing machine. Usually the first, I'm just going to move this foot for a minute so we can see here. So over here, this first line on your guide plate is usually 3/8 of an inch. The 1/4 inch indication is in line with the feed dogs. So I've just put a little piece of washi tape down in line with my 1/4 inch seam allowance, just so that it gives me a really clear indication of where that seam allowance is. Because when I'm sewing with my big walking foot, sometimes it gets in the way of where the 1/4 inch seam allowance is. So just to make things clear, use a little bit of tape. All right, so popping my foot back on, and let's get sewing. All right, so starting with my first seam along this thumb edge here. And you're going to just sew a back stitch at the beginning and end of every seam that we sew. As you remove the wonder clips, just make sure you're pinching the layers together. Okay. So when I'm sewing on these really tight curves, it's a really sort of tight sort of pivot that you've got to make on that curve. It's really tricky when you're sewing these small curves because you can't really align that to the seam allowance there. So you're just sort of doing your best to align the edge to that seam allowance indication just before it hits the needle. But if you'll just notice, I'm just sort of pivoting on this finger here as I sew. And then as soon as you can align that edge back to that seam allowance indication, then you're going to get back on track. And at the end here, just make sure you're just sort of like pivoting out a little, because we want to end this stitch just sort of angled back towards this edge right here, like that. So now what I want to do is just eliminate some of the bulk along the curved edges of the seam allowance. When I turn this thumb seam right side out, I just want to make sure that the seam allowance doesn't sort of bulk up on itself. So by eliminating this seam allowance along the curve, it's going to help this thumb to be a little bit less bulky and more comfortable to wear. So just cut out little wedges from the seam allowance. And when you do this, you just want to make sure that you're not cutting right up to the stitch line, very close to it, but just give it a little bit of space because you don't want to cut that stitch. All right, so that, I'll do one more. And then on this curved edge here, just make a little cut in towards the stitch and another one over here. So we're not really cutting wedges out at these points. We're just cutting a slice into it so that this seam can open up. And in this case, this seam can sort of lay flat when it turns right side out. So let's turn it. And you might want to take your scissors and just gently poke this out. Don't push too hard. You can even use a chopstick or a knitting needle, but just get that thumb turned out. Okay. So there you have the palm of the mitten. And now what we're going to do is apply the face of the mitten to the palm. So you can take either one of the face pieces and we're going to place it right sides together onto the palm of the mitten, and we're going to use Wonder Clips again to attach these pieces together. Now this notch over here that we've indicated with thread on our mitten face is going to align to the seam on either side. So just make sure that when you're pinning these pieces together with Wonder Clips, you're just aligning the seam to the notch. The other thing you want to keep in mind is this thumb is going to be turning towards the top of the mitten. So we just want to make sure that this seam allowance on the leather is turned upwards towards the top of the mitten when we sew this seam. All right, so I'll put my clips here and I'll start pinning at those notches. And you're probably looking at my Wonder Clips and thinking, those aren't Wonder Clips. You're right, they're not. But in the spirit of upcycling, I'm using the clips that come with our coffee grinds, and they work like Wonder Clips. So use whatever you have. All right, so that works. Now, again, just making sure that this seam is turned towards the tip of the mitten on either side. And anytime I'm sewing two different kinds of fabric together in one seam, I always like to think about which layer of these two fabrics is going to stretch out the most, which one is going to need help kind of getting stretched back into shape. So the knit here is a lot stretchier and has much more movement than the leather. And what you'll find is that on your sewing machine, let's say you're not working with a walking foot, the presser foot is going to push whatever is on the top layer, and the feed dog is going to pull the under layer away from you. So in this case, I would say work with the knit on the underside and the leather on the top. I'm working with a walking foot, so I'm probably going to find that there's a bit of an even experience from you know, the top or the bottom doesn't really matter, but just going with that sort of rule of thumb, I'm going to work with the knit on the underside. Okay, so let's sew this at 1/4 inch all the way around. I'm finding that my knit is very spongy to sew, so I'm just going to do something here called taut sewing, where I give a bit of an even pull from the back of the machine and at the front. So I'm not pulling all the way at the front because that will shorten my stitches. I want to make sure that when I do this, I'm not changing the stitch length. So just to give sort of an even feed, helping the fabric feed through the machine, I'm going to give a little bit of tension at the front and at the back of the fabric as I sew. And just making sure that my foot doesn't get cut or caught in my little thumb area there. I'm lifting my foot up, just making sure it's sitting on top. I will also add, if you're finding that the two fabrics combined is feeding very slowly in your machine, you can also lengthen your stitch length. Alright, so this seam, as we're sewing over this, just make sure as we take that wonder clip off, that as the foot comes in the opposing direction, that that seam allowance stays turned towards the tip of the mitten. Alright, so let's take a look. Okay, so we've got the beautiful outer layer of the mitten. It's turning out really nicely so far. So we've got to add the lining and the cuff. Okay, so now we're going to start with the lining. On my mittens, I'm doing the insulation layer. When you're doing insulation, if you've got the kind that I've got, that is the insole fleece, you'll notice that there's like a metal side to it. So you're going to want to make sure that the metal side is face down onto the wrong side of your lining. So what I'll do is just pin the two pieces together, and I'm just going to sort of baste around the perimeter of these pieces at just inside my 1/4 inch seam allowance, so just at a scant 1/4 inch. Okay, so I'm ready to sew. I'm just going to lengthen my stitch length to a longer stitch, about between 4 and 5. Okay, so I'm going to repeat that step with all of these lining pieces, and this is now going to act as one layer, and then from there I'm just going to sew my lining together. Alright, so I've got my lining pieces and they're all basted around the perimeter with the insulation. So now I'm just going to finish sewing the lining together. I'm going to run through these steps that are similar to the steps for the outer layer of the mitten. I'm just going to sew along the perimeter of that thumb seam, and then this component will open up, and then I'm going to take the other lining component right sides together, and then we're going to just sew around this perimeter here. Okay, so now that we've sewn this seam, we need to do the same clipping and notching on this seam allowance as we did with the leather. So just take little wedges out of the seam. Just again, being careful not to cut that stitch. Okay, and then just in this curved area right here, just cut towards the stitch and over here. All right. And like we did with the outer layer, just making sure that this seam is turning towards the top of the mitten when we're sewing. So I'm just making sure that I'm pinning that seam in the direction that I want it to turn. Okay, so I've got that one side of the lining done, and I'll repeat the steps on the other side of the lining. But for now, let's put this together with the outer layer of the mitten. So put your hand inside the lining, keeping it wrong side out, and grab your outer layer, and you're going to stick your hand in to the outer layer, inserting the lining into it. So just make sure that the thumb is in there comfortably, and it's all fitted in properly. Now what we're going to do is align the edge and sew around the perimeter. So when we're doing this, we just want to offset the seam allowances from the lining and the outer layer. So I'm just going to turn them in opposite directions. So the outer layer is going to turn towards the palm, and the lining layer is going to turn towards the face. So just clip those together with Wonder Clips. Okay, so the reason why we're offsetting the seam allowance is just to balance the bulk of the seam allowance on that seam. If they were both turned to the same direction, it would be very bulky and possibly very hard to sew through. All right, so I'll just stick one more clip on there, and then I'm just gonna set my machine to the longest stitch length. And I'm going to baste around this perimeter at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. The fur is going to cover this baste stitch, so don't worry if it's not beautiful. You've got a lot of layers in here, so it might be a little bit of a messy stitch. That's fine. Let's just attach them together. So you can start anywhere on this circumference, but I'll just say what you want to do. This is a very small opening here, and it's not possible to get it onto the little arm of our machine. So the easiest way to approach this stitch is just to kind of approach it sewing on the lining side. So the presser foot should be on the lining side, and the top of the mitten should just be turned away, and we're just going to rotate it around as we sew. So those layers are attached, and it's ready for the fur to go on. Okay, so it's time to sew the fur, and this might feel a little intimidating in case you've never sewn fur before, but it's really not that bad. So what you want to do is take the two short sides, folding them right sides together, and when we're preparing this edge for sewing, we just kind of want to tuck the fluff of the fur inside and just sort of get it out of the way of this little area where we're about to sew. And again, you don't want to use pins here. Let's just use a little clip to hold that together. And we're just going to begin and end with a back stitch on either side. Again, we're sewing with a little bit of a longer stitch length. I'm at 3.5 here, and so we're sewing this at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. All right, so I've got the cuff sewn. I'm going to turn it right side in, and now I want to put it right sides together to the opening with my mitten. So I'm just going to slip it on to the mitten, and I'm going to align the seam in the cuff with one of the seams on the mitten, and I'm just going to clip it along the perimeter of the opening. As I do this, just again, tuck the fur inside so that you can't see it along that edge. So it takes a little bit of time just to tuck the fur in, but just inch your way along and it'll eventually behave. All right, so once it's clipped along the perimeter, just making sure that my edges are aligning. So I'm just putting the last clip on, and I'm just gonna sew this around the perimeter all the way around at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So you might not be able to get a clear visual on your alignment for your seam allowance because it's, you know, there's fur in the way. But what you can do is just sew inside the base stitch that exists there. So that's sort of a good guideline for you to follow for this stitch. And we're going to be sewing it the same way that we did when we did our base stitch around the perimeter of the mitten. So just sort of opening up this area of the mitten and sewing on the lining side. Now it's a little bit different, so just inch your way along here as we go. And just be careful as you're sewing this that the fur isn't slipping away. So take care just to make sure that the edges are aligned as you go. One thing I'll just make note of is I'm going to lengthen my stitch length a little bit here just because I've got an extra layer of density. The fur is quite thick with the texture of the fur, so I'm going to bump it up to a 4. Test it with your project and just see how it's working for you. And on that note, I'll just say one thing you don't want is for your stitches to be so short that it basically creates a tear in the skin of the fur, because essentially fur, this side of it is leather, so we do have to kind of make sure that it doesn't tear if we're sewing with the stitches too close together. And I'm just sort of rolling the mitten as I go and opening it up. And with this amount of density, the amount of layers that we're sewing, you definitely have to kind of help the fabric through so that it feeds evenly through the machine. So that method of taut sewing will come in handy here as well. Okay, now just end with a little back stitch. And the fur is attached. I'm just gonna go around this perimeter where I've just sewn and just cut any little bits of fur that's sort of hanging off the edge. Just to eliminate bulk for a future step. All right, so on to the last step. All right, so this is the final step, the moment of truth. And we can just sort of flip this over and start to see how this is looking. And it's so beautiful. And so what we want to do is just double up the fur and clean finish this seam here that we've just sewn. So the easiest way to do that is just to sort of continue turning the mitten inside out. Not all the way, but just until the lining is about a 1/4 way turned out. And then what we're gonna do is just take that fur and fold it so that the edge here will cover this seam and just meet up with the lining. So this is going to encase that seam and clean finish it. And what's happening is the tension that I'm going to be creating around the band here is going to hold this fur in place so that when I hand sew it in place, I don't really need to have pins to hold it in place. So I'm just going to go ahead and lift this fur edge up to my lining. Okay. All right, so now it's time to hand sew this. So I've got a little needle and thread prepared over here. I've threaded it so that it's like a double layer of thread and just long enough for me to go around this mitten. And let's just dive into this. So we're going to sew a whip stitch all the way around. And whip stitch is probably one of the easiest, most forgiving hand stitches. But what you're going to do is let's just start in with the pin going inside the fur. So it's like on the underside. And this is just going to hide the knot in my thread. To be honest, this is going to all be covered by fur anyway, so it's not a huge concern if we hide the knot, but let's just do it. All right, so I'm going to sort of hold this fur out of the way as I sew, and with my knot anchored in my fur, I'm just going to come over to my lining and form a little stitch in the lining. And then I'm going to make a little stitch about 1/8 of an inch down from the edge into the fur. And I'm going to just keep going in that order. And anytime you see a little part of that seam from the edge of the mitten popping out, just tuck it back in. So taking a little stitch about 1/4 inch or so into the lining, and then come over and go into the fur, just about 1/8 of an inch from the edge. Now I've just got my thimble here, and I do find sometimes some fur, the skin is thicker and it's harder to push that pin through. So if you have a situation like that, it's really helpful to use a thimble to help to get that needle through that leather. I'm finding this one's quite soft, so I'm going to continue without it. But if you struggle, know that you have that as a helper. You can also get curved needles. You know, sometimes when you buy those like packs of assortment needles, they have, I think they call it an upholstery needle, and it's curved. That's a nice needle to use for this step because we're working with these two sort of flat edges and the fur is furry. The curved needle helps to kind of like dig up in from the underside, and it just makes it a little bit easier, but I tend to just use the straight needles because they're easier to find. But if you've got that curved needle and you've always wondered, what do you use this for? Well, you can try it now. So here I have a little knot. Sometimes the fur clusters get kind of tangled in the thread, so just watch out for that. And one thing you can also do to strengthen your thread whenever you're hand sewing is before you start, if you have a little piece of beeswax, run the beeswax along the thread, and that will strengthen it. It also helps it to prevents it from getting tangled as you sew. Okay, so now I'm back where I started. I'm going to end this hand stitch with a knot. So I'm just going to stick my thread through the fabric one more time just to secure it. And I'm going to do a few knots in one spot at the end of at the base of my thread. And then I'll just cut it about 1 centimeter away from the knot. And if there's loose threads from the beginning of where you started, just cut that. Okay, so let's see the big reveal. Nice. So you just want to kind of fluff it out, get that fur out of the seam, and there we go. It's beautiful. Well guys, that's it. We are done our project. Thank you so much for joining me in making these mittens. I hope you learned something new. I hope you enjoyed doing it. And I hope you really love wearing your new mittens or giving them away to someone that you love. I am going to be back here again soon with another video. And in the meantime, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Happy sewing. Bye.